When it comes to Bootstrap, understanding Bootstrap's grid system is a crucial part of understanding how Bootstrap handles responsive design. So here we've got a sample of Bootstrap and its grid system. So on the outside you've got your container, and then you've got rows, and each row contains a set of columns, and to get a full width on the columns it should equal 12 because it's 12 columns across the entire page. Columns can be either 1, they could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So all depending on what width you want, what percentage you want to go across that particular page. If you wanted to do a combination that equals up to 4 or equals up to 12, you could do 4 and 8. So any numbers that equal up to 12. So we see here we've got 8 and 4, we've got 4, 4, 4, we've got 6 and 6. Here we've got 4, 1, and 8 ones. And when we look at it within the browser, we see that we do have all the different columns here. So here we had 4, we had the 8 ones, we had 8, we had 4, 4, 4, 4, and 6 and 6. And you can see that it neatly fits within the container area of the Bootstrap layout. What does this all mean when it comes to responsive? So there's going to be 4 different classes that you can use for sizing. And just to give you an illustration of how this is going to work, we see that when we do shrink down the page size, so this is to simulate full-size desktop, and then we shrink it down and we get roughly to a tablet size, and we see that the grid still hasn't changed because we're using SM. So this indicates for the smallest within this format is going to be SM. So if we go to an XS, which would be for a phone or an even smaller screen, we see that we lose all of our grid and it actually becomes all individual. They're all now individual rows, and you can see when we go back out, we see that our grid comes back. And this is what responsive design does, is it allows you to shrink to different screen sizes and still use the same coding. So when you're planning out your responsive design layout, you should always take that into consideration, that you're actually going to be working across at least 3 different sizes, where you've got your XS, you've got your SM, and then you've got your MD for desktops, and then even on the larger side you've got your larger desktops, so the LG. So for the most part MD and LG are used interchangeably, but if you do want to ensure that you do have on the Mac side, you could be using LG. To get a better idea of this, you can go to bootstrap.com CSS, and here they do have what the grid options are. So as we mentioned, that for extra small devices, so these are going to be your mobile phones, the ones with the really small screens that are less than 768 pixels wide, that's going to be your column XS. If you're going to be larger than 768 but less than 992, you're going to use column SM. And as you can see, there's a little bit of lap over, and this is because the columns itself have a gutter, what's called a gutter. So there's a gutter width in between there, so they're not exactly going to overlap. But container width here, so this is 750, this container width is going to be 970, and this container width is going to be 1170. So that gives you an idea of the container size, and then the columns contained within that container are going to match within this grid pattern. Down below they have some examples here of stacked to horizontal, so they have all the different columns here, and they're MD columns, so they're going to shrink on anything less than this, so anything less than the medium device screen size, it's going to shrink down to rows. As you can see, the columns actually rearrange depending on your screen size. So your big screen size can look actually different than your smaller screen sizes, and here they've got some examples of some mixed mobile and desktop. And the way that this is going to work is when you're including the excess. So this is gonna simplify the stack in smaller devices. As you can see, when we do shrink it down less than the MD, so when we're shrinking it down to the smaller sizes, we see that it is stacking. So instead of actually going through and having only one row because it's less than the MD size, we see that it does still have those two columns there. So going into the rows, and you could shrink it down all the way, and you should be able to still see, as within this example, you can still see that we do have the XS6, we have the XS6 there, and we're only using the 4 when we're actually within the size that we can use that for. Expand our view to a size that accommodates the SM, the 4. We see that in fact it does actually go out to there. So there's the column SM4, and when we go out a little bit further, we see that we do get the column SM4 or the MD4 as well. So this is so basically when you include the excess, that's going to limit it to what it's going to shrink down. So normally if I was to shrink this down, these would, when it gets under that MD size, which is up here, when it gets under that 992, that's 768, it shrinks down and it restacks into additional rows. So it's not doing that because of the excess, and that's why it's not, it's locking that down into being separated columns. So if your design does call for it, then make sure that you are including those excess as well. So here we have a mixture of XS, SM, and here we have MD. So just like in the previous example, you can see that when you do adjust to whatever size is that width. So here we've got for mobile, tablet, and desktop. So we've got a mobile layout, we've got a tablet layout, and then we have a desktop layout. If you do combine classes in this way, you're actually going to be creating really dynamic, flexible layouts that are going to be able to accommodate all that responsiveness. And back to when you're using multiple classes, so you got to always remember that it's going to scale up. So if you want to have it limited to always be 12 columns or a width of 12 here, you could just leave in that XS12, and that will scale it up, and you don't have to include the rest of these. You don't have to do SM12, MD12, unless you want to have different of columns within here. So, and that's the only time that you actually have to include all these additional classes for the sizing. So once you start thinking in 12s and creating your BootStrap layouts to be designed, so depending on the size, if you do need more text within a really small area, then that's something to keep in mind. Or if you don't want your picture to stack over and go the full width, or if you do want to have like maybe a comparison, pros and cons chart, so you don't want to have that stack below. And those are the things that you got to keep in mind when you are making your layout. So if it is something that needs to be side by side, to make sure that you are working that in within the coding. So making sure that if it is something that has to work in within there, make sure that you're using XS. Change that to XS, and I do make that change. You see that it does lock in that that 4, and then here it's counting it as 1, and then these additional ones get a separate row. So it will fill out the rest of the 12. So even though this 4 and 1 isn't going to equal up to 12, this XS is only going to be 4, so it's only going to take 4 spots there, and that's going to leave the space here, and automatically the next one is going to stack in there. So this is the second one that's stacking in. Maybe we'll just change it to 1 and 2, so you could better get an idea of what's happening within the stacking here. So because 1 has an excess of 4, it's only going to use up these 4 columns. So this one here is going to be still reserved for the additional excess of 8, and this one's going to take the spacing for that. And then these additional ones, they get a separate row each because they're SM, they're SM1. So once it shrinks down to that excess size, you see that they do get additional rows on their own. So it doesn't always need to add up to 12, but if it doesn't add up to 12, then depending on what size you're using down here, and if it fits within that excess 4, it'll stack that in next to it. But if this doesn't fit within that excess 4, so if we had an excess 9, that's not going to equal 12, and we see that this automatically gets bumped to the next row, but the next one that fits into that spacing gets stacked within there. So there is a little bit of time to kind of get used to the way that this works. And we've also have a fluid container, so if we change, and then again, as we mentioned before, the difference between fluid and just container is that fluid does 100%, whereas container sets it to a max of 1170. So depending on what size your desktop screen is, that's what it's going to be able to resize to. So, and it doesn't really make a difference once you get under 1170 because you're going to be taking up the full size anyway. You see that it's still taking up the full size, so you can't really see a difference between container and container fluid if you're under 1170. But if you're above 1170, then you start seeing that you do get that gutter and that border there coming in.